Good day, everyone. What I want to discuss is the use of hydro-cyclones in a mineral processing and metallurgical plant. Now, a hydrocyclone is a fairly versatile device, and in mineral processing, the reason for that being is it's a low cost for the amount of product or particles that you want to separate. Now, it's a hydraulic sizing device, which means is that it uses hydraulics to, water flow to separate particles, and it can do that. And so the density of a particle, its SG, also has an influence on the separation of a particle. But a hydrocyclone is not just for size classification. It can be quite useful in dewatering and desliming applications in a mineral processing and metallurgical flow sheet. Now, having said that, what I'm going to do is my presentations and also the tools that I create and that I'm going to give out for free are available by you going to this https or offer.ndme-inc.com. You'll go to this page here, you put in your name and email address, and basically I will send you a link to get access to this, and I'll be adding a lot more Excel tools and free pieces of literature that I've gathered throughout my career that I would believe would be quite useful to a minerals engineer or process engineer in the mining industry. Now, getting back to how does a cyclone work? Now, a cyclone can be either gravity or pump fed, and if you consider it that if you think of thermodynamically, you need energy because you're going to separate this thing, create more order. And we all know about the second law of thermodynamics. So where does the energy come for the separation of the particles into larger and smaller particles? And that's basically by pump or gravity fed that is feeding into the cyclone. Now, if you think of a cyclone, it is actually essentially a T-piece, but it's a bit of a more sophisticated T-piece because what happens is you've basically got an inlet, and you've got the outlet at the bottom, and you've got the outlet at the top. But the fluid comes in tangentially, and it goes into like a centrifugal type of flow arrangement, as illustrated by these lines over here. And so what happens is the larger particles go and they sit on the outside wall, larger/heavier particles on the outside wall because they're bigger. And the smaller particles literally get dragged by the centrifugal force, by the water. And typically you have on the overflow of the cyclone, at the overflow, which is illustrated over here, you literally have, it's the largest opening, literally the water almost gets sucked out there. So you can imagine the smaller particles, because of their large drag around them, for a lot of surface area per weight, get literally dragged into the overflow, and the underflow, basically the larger particles go to the bottom. So it's a fairly simple device, but the more you study it and try and do the fluid flow of it, it becomes quite an intriguing device. Having said that, the confines of this presentation is not going to be how to size a cyclone. I strongly suggest that you speak to your preferred cyclone supplier and get them to give you the cyclone sizing that you should do. I'm going to give general indications of what you should be looking for, and also the other thing needs to be mentioned is that I will be giving out a tool that will allow you to see the typical mass balance you can expect around a cyclone, and then it becomes quite easy for the cyclone supplier to get a matching cyclone to give you the type of mass balance that you want around your cyclone. So that tool will be available shortly. And as I said, you can go to that website that I showed to input your email address, and you will get access to the tool that I will be putting in there. But having said that, the other thing is, as I said, just thinking of the forces that work on a on a particle in a cyclone, i.e. as it is the centrifugal force, as it makes the larger particles go to the outside, and the drag forces, i.e. the water and the way the water wants to flow, makes often the particles also go the other direction. So you can imagine the smaller particles follow the water, the larger ones are more influenced by centrifugal forces working in on them. Now, the way a cyclone often is created by the various suppliers, they actually all follow almost the same rule. They have, a cyclone is really a number of components that the various suppliers put together. And if you think about it, you have an inlet head, you have barrels, you have cones, and you have a spigot, a holder with a spigot in it, and a vortex finder. Now, they can give you, put in 2 barrels, they can put in 3 cones, or they can change the cone angle, they can change the spigot ID for you, they can change the vortex finder ID. And if you can think about it, you know, each one of those permutations gives you thousands of configurations that are available. So having said that, I'm just going to go through the various components of a cyclone. The firstly is you'll have the overflow bend, then you'll have a vortex finder. Now that is, as I said, that's where the larger particles, sorry, smaller particles go following the centrifugal force. Then there's the inlet head, which is basically, it's probably from a manufacturing perspective of a cyclone the most intriguing part, and a lot of in the early days of cyclone development, a lot of competition between the various cyclone suppliers was how they did the inlet design. Yes, but they've mostly all of them come more or less to the similar type of an inlet head design. So that doesn't really make much of a difference between the various cyclone suppliers, for one. Then you've got a cone, barrel. Then you've got also the spigot. And as I said, a cyclone is a T-piece, and the way which is quite ingenious is how basically all the suppliers do it, is that because these are interchangeable, my suggestion is for the vortex finder, if they've got a large, medium, and small, make sure that the vendor specifies you the medium one generally. The reason being is you can go up or down, because remember, often you come into the plant and you say you want that cyclone, but things change. So you need to have a little bit of flexibility in being able to change things on your cyclone to accommodate changes on your plant. The other thing is also to look at the vortex finder, and this is even cheaper. It's a fairly cheap component, and they've typically, most suppliers have a spigot holder, and these spigots are really, we are talking if $100, it's that. You know, and you can change that out quite quickly. You can do it within 5 or 10 minutes, so you don't even need a shift shutdown. You can almost do it on an emergency stop. You can actually change a spigot out if you really needed to. Having said that, there are certain things that influence a cyclone's efficiency of separation. You remember, you want to typically separate on size, and you don't want the stuff that is small and supposed to report to the small reporting to the large particle size, and you don't want the large particle sizes reporting to which are reporting to where the small particle sizes should happen. But as in most unit processes in industry, they're not perfect separators. You would not get that. Not even a screen is like that unless you are prepared to pay a heck of a lot of money. But you can typically you can have short circuiting in 2 ways. You can have large particles basically coming in, and they literally short circuit like that to the vortex finder, and you could lose them. Lose your large particles because they should be going to this underflow of the cyclone. You could lose them there. The other one is also that because you've got fluid drag, some of your small particles can get caught in this drag down here to the bottom, and that's also what's often not a good idea to run a cyclone at excessively high RDs, because then you have too many particles here. Your small particles get trapped in the crowd, if I can put it that way, and they literally can't get into the central air core to be actually sucked up, and then you have a lot of the fine particles going to where the coarse particles are, so that affects your separation efficiency. Now, the way one measures a cyclone's performance is with a Tromp curve, or a probability distribution curve, or a partition curve. Now, they're all the same thing. Basically, it's a cumulative probability distribution curve. if you look at it from a statistical perspective. And the way you would basically set up the curve is you would size the particles going into the cyclone, and you take a sample of the underflow and the overflow of the cyclone, and you would say what percentage of a certain size goes to the overflow, because remember the balance then goes to the underflow. And for argument's sake, that's what you would do. So you'd say the larger particle has a 100% probability, or in your case 100% of them went to the overflow. Then you'll do the same for a particle 80 micron in this case, then it's 70 micron, and so you would go, and then you'd build basically this actual probability distribution curve. Now, once you've built the distribution curve, there are ways of fitting various mathematical functions to it. It's just an interpretation of what you already can measure, or the performance of the curve. And then there are three parameters that actually dictate how this curve looks, or where it's where it fits. Now, one is the imperfection, or the angle of the slope. The steeper it is, the more it's like an ideal separator, so you don't have the short circuiting as I showed to you in the previous slide. Then also the D50, you know, you want to, it's, as you have moved the D50 up or down, you would change the cut size. Now, as a general rule of thumb, that the larger a cyclone is, the coarser it's cut. Now, that's one of the parameters. There are others, but generally. Now, so, and the reason for that, just think about that. If you remember the ladies that's ice skating, when they bring their hands in, they turn faster and faster. So what you can see is that the centrifugal force becomes faster and faster the smaller a cyclone is. Hence, you've got enough centrifugal force to overcome the drag forces experienced by small particles, and hence that's why the general rule like that applies. Then the other parameter, as I've mentioned, as I showed in the previous slide, is that short circuiting to the underflow. Now, if you think of it, a very small particle, let's call it close to atomic size, would literally follow a water particle. So now that's why it's such a way of just looking at following the water. So if you would say 100 cubes of water came into the cyclone and 10 cubes goes to the underflow, the smallest particle has a 10 over 100, 10% chance of going to the underflow. In this case, I've got a 20%. So that's what we had over here. That's just as a general trend, what you would experience. Another thing, having said, this is the actual probability distribution curve. Often what vendors do is they would quote the sharpness of separation and the D50 on the ideal separation, or corrected, where they actually take out this short circuiting to the underflow out. And the reason being is they say that they do not control the RD that you feed a cyclone to the plant, so they can only guarantee that curve's performance. Well, fair enough, if that's the case, but just be aware that when they talk to you, they will often be referring to that, and you thinking they're talking about that, and it's not necessarily the same thing. So just bear that in mind in practice. Now, as I said, if you think of it, that short circuiting to the underflow is really a game of the water. So the feed percent solids in the water and underflow is seriously what dictates the alpha water. Then the other factors that influence the sharpness of the curve that I just showed will be centrifugal force, which is ideally cyclone size. Crowding in the cyclone, think about that. If it's a traffic problem, if the small particle wants to go to the overflow, it just can't because there are big particles in its way. So that's where RD has an influence. Turbulence, can have an influence as well. Drag, and these are also functions of other things that you can control, i.e. remember that I said a cyclone is made of various components. If you were to be able to make the cyclone longer, what you do is you create residence time in the cyclone. So it is a contributor to more effective separation. But having said that, what I've found is there's not going to, even between different cyclone suppliers and cyclones and stuff like it, we argue too often as metallurgists till the cows come home, you are not going to get that separation efficiency curve moving so much in terms of the sharpness of cut. I personally would focus far more on alpha water as a practical metallurgist than trying to get this perfect separation going. And typically, a vendor is not going to quote you an imperfection factor of better than 0.35. So you're not going to score much out of it. And in my next video, I'm also going to show the tool that to predict the mass balance around a cyclone that you can expect, and that will give you a good tool to be able to facilitate the communication between you and your vendor. Because you can give him the mass balance and your expected size distribution, so at least you guys will be talking the same language, and let him then decide on what cyclone you need. There are ways, and I'll much later will give you ways on which to size the cyclone at least that you need, but it's not part of my scope and that I'm going to do now. Then, as I've showed you, and I said previously in that when I showed the graph, I was talking about probability distribution curves. As metallurgists, we often use generally two curves, the Rosin, Rammler, and the Whiten, and all they are mathematical representations. So, and often people, academics, make a big story about these two, but it's not really. They are two cumulative probability distribution curves. As a type of math curve. You can go and look in any statistical book and you will find plenty of probability distribution curves that you can fit. But as metallurgists, to facilitate communication between us, we often have two broad schools that we use, as Rosin, Rammler, and the Whiten. I almost personally view it as the Australian and the Canadian types of curves. Okay, having said that, you, as I said when I was giving you the that curve and I was showing it, you've got a sharpness of cut and a D50. Both of these have a D50 in them. They have a sharpness of cut, which is basically that slope. And I'll say to you, the alpha water is really based on the RD and how you control that, and a little bit more about that later. But the point being is that you've really, the only real differentiator between these two curves is the alpha and the M parameter, as some of them call it in the Rosin Rammler case. But the good news is there is some relationships between the alpha and the M, so this you could call your universal Babel translator between the alpha, the M, and the imperfection and the M. And remember, I did show you, there was in that graph that I showed, I did show the formula of imperfection as well. So having said that, let's just talk about some general installation considerations when you speak to a cyclone supply. Now, think of a cyclone like this: as you've got the head, a particle comes in, there's the curvature of the head of the cyclone, it goes like this. So now you want, if it's turning left, a particle, you always want to keep it turning left. You don't want it turning right and then left. The reason being is, you think of it in a pipe, and the pipe bend turns like this before it comes into the cyclone. The particle sitting on this side of the wall, and then you've got the cyclone curving like this, and suddenly it has to go from this side to the other side, and so that whole thing stuffs up your performance. So as a general rule, have the bending of the cyclone the pipe coming into the cyclone inlet the same direction as the cyclone. Then the other thing is that often there's small little things, but they do make a big difference, is if the inlet, you've got a flange between what the cyclone supply gives you and your pipe flange. And a big mistake guys often make is they have the flange of the pipe coming into the cyclone larger than the cyclone. What you have is a little step created there. Now, this has two detrimental effects on you. The first is it creates turbulence, so your separation efficiency goes for it, and it's also a little step where there becomes a wear place occurs, and hence there's wear, so it costs you money. As another note, cyclones can come in clusters or single cyclones, and the cyclone suppliers often give you clusters of cyclones. And as a general rule, said you want smaller cyclones if you want to cut at a very small size, and then to get the volume up, you have a lot of cyclones in these cyclone clusters. So generally, there's a lot of debate that has to go between you and your vendor that supplies you in terms of what space you have, cost considerations, etc., in terms of your cyclones. And try to get in communication with your vendor. My general tip would be try and get the cyclone that is as close as possible to his most popular type of cyclone configuration. Considering the fact that I've also mentioned is ask him just that whatever the vortex finder size is it easy to change the size up or down? And the spigot, is it easy to change that size up or down? It just gives you flexibility in operation. And if you consider those facts, that's probably the best cyclone you're going to have for your particular needs in your plant. And the reason I say standard cyclone is because often he carries a larger inventory of it, and if something goes wrong, you can phone a good supplier, tring tring, and ask him for that that specific component that is your problem. So that's just as a general tip there. Then another thing is in operation consideration. Remember, I've been going on a lot about the alpha water, the short circuiting of the water to the underflow, which is something you can control to a certain extent in operations. You've got some mass balance constraints, but there is some things you can do. The one thing is that often if you have your spigot of your cyclone too big, you can have and your cyclone would flare out like this. You have a lot of dilution. It's not necessarily a crisis. It's just the thing is that you're pumping a lot of maybe needless water around. It could be a bit of operating costs, and your cyclone's not operating the best, but it's not really a crisis. It's just something that you should consider. The typical optimum is that you try and make the cyclone spigot smaller and smaller. And the reason is you want to almost squeeze the water out. Remember I said that alpha water is the ratio of the water going to the underflow over the amount of water coming in. If you can get that smaller, you can actually influence the cyclone actual performance the most. But the bad news is, as you decrease that cyclone spigot size, you get to a condition which is called roping. You don't actually have any flare happening. And what happens then is basically you shut down that air core in the cyclone. You've got no air core, and because of that, your that centrifugal force just disappears, and you have a lot less separation. So you try and avoid a condition known as roping. And as a general also rule, I try and have the feed to a cyclone around 20% by volume. Yes, you can go up to 25, you can even go 30, but consider the fact that your performance of your cyclone is going to decrease horribly. Going lower than the 20% is not really such a concern. It's probably more an issue that you're pumping a lot more water than you need to around, but often that's something you can do nothing about, because not due to the cyclone, but things happening up front in your flow sheet. But having said that, your cyclone underflow typically has a 45% solids by volume as its limit. Now you can go higher, but as a general trend, I would avoid up front going higher than a 45% by volume in the spigot of a cyclone. There's been various pieces of work, and that's pretty safe number to work at, but as you can imagine, you need to have extra water than the amount of water going out there. Remember, it's the smallest opening of a cyclone is actually what's happening at the spigot. So what you're trying to do is make sure, that's why 45% is probably your very, very absolute limit, and I wouldn't even be close to that. But anyway, that's the amount of, but you need extra water coming into the cyclone to drive the separation. So just having those considerations. So anyway, so I've given you an overview of the cyclones and how they've you operate, and your installation and design considerations. In other talks, I will go into them, how you can fit them into your flow sheets in various places and things like that.